right, can everyone hear me okay at this volume? Okay, I have kind of a soft voice, so. Thank you all for being here. It really means a lot to have just moved to Oregon and be able to share this personal project. Thank you to Yu Young, M, and C for just being the best and really supporting me through this. He's not here, but I'd also like to thank Adam DeSorbo for production support and framing. I could not have made a show look this beautiful without him, so I'm really grateful. So I'm just going to talk a bit about my journey with this project, my influences, and just sort of how it came to be. So I'm going to start with a quote. It's from Roland Barthes. Ultimately, or at the limit, in order to see a photograph well, it is best to look away or close your eyes. The necessary condition for an image is sight, Janusz told Kafka, and Kafka smiled and replied, "We photograph things in order to drive them out of our minds. My stories are a way of shutting my eyes." I really like this quote because I feel like it emphasizes this paradox in photography, how photography can capture a moment, but it can also create this distance from it as well. I think, especially with this project, photography is working in that way for me. I'm a big believer in intuitive working and the unconscious, and I feel like photography for me is this powerful tool for self-discovery and a way to process the world around me. With that being said, I still feel like I'm very much a student of photography and art more generally, and I feel like I'm still in this journey of figuring out my voice completely in the medium. So I'm going to go into a little bit of background about myself. I did not grow up in a creative household. This is a picture of my parents. They were both smoke jumpers for the Forest Service. They met in the early 90s. Smoke jumping, for everyone who doesn't know, is a type of wildland firefighting where people jump out of planes into fires in remote areas. And having two parents in this field, there was a level of intensity in the home, extreme physicality, self-reliance, and beyond the home, the broader culture I was raised in was very defined by a particular white masculinity that was super heteronormative. It taught young men to be violent, and a lot of my photography and my work is sort of deconstructing these experiences and growing up in this culture. So for this third slide, so my parents split when I was 7, and my mom moved my brother and I to a town of 700 in Idaho. And that's the town that inspired this project. It's sort of the setting where all my transformative, important queer experiences took place. I have this picture by Peter Hujar. I'm supposed to be writing a paper about these photographs for school right now, but I just feel like this picture sort of encapsulates a nostalgic feeling of my childhood for me, just sort of this tenderness. I grew up with a lot of animals. I used to raise sheep and show them at the county fair. So yeah. I got into photography when I was a teenager. I immediately fell in love with the medium. I was hooked immediately because the camera provided this way for me to express myself and my gaze in a way that was maybe more obscured or poetic, and it sort of gave me agency to be in the world and reflect. I initially came into photography. We always had like National Geographics around the house, So it was this journalistic narrative impulse in photography that that's what I thought photography was. So I decided to attend college at the University of Montana because it somehow ended up being more affordable than Boise State. And they had a really great photojournalism program. And it was a very traditional photojournalism program in the way that your sources weren't your friends, objectivity, you shouldn't see the voice of the photographer in any of the images, which I think are all important ideas to strive for in journalism, but it sort of took away the magic of the medium for me, working in this super clinical way. I also was on the school paper, and I didn't love taking pictures at football games and things like that. And I have this quote by Robert Adams that I feel like defines this well for me. Art addresses an inner struggle, whereas journalism more often reports on the outward consequences of it. I feel like that encapsulates this feeling well. So I took one art class, and it was a printmaking class, and I was immediately hooked and sort of exposed to art more generally, more widely. I'd never really considered being an artist as a job or contemporary art more widely. And we were talking about poetics and form, so I switched majors. So these two pictures here are the first pictures I made in this body of work. It was in 2019. This is cringy, but at the end of the 2020s, there was this insurgence of YouTubers making videos about film photography, and I was sort of just like very captivated by the aesthetics of it. And I wrote a grant, and I got the grant, and I bought my first film camera. And I really enjoyed the process and stumbling around, the removal, the distance created through the process. So I knew I wanted to talk about these landscapes I grew up in. I had many secret boyfriends in high school, and we would drive out into the landscape for privacy. And there was this heightened sense of fear and ecstasy, and it was all sort of held in this dry, harsh Idaho landscape. And I knew I wanted to capture this feeling or these memories in some way. So I started taking film photographs in these locations. And at the beginning, they were much more direct and leaned into a more direct narrative, like these two on the screen here. So it was just beginning. And then COVID happened, and my classes stopped. I just sort of entered art, and I wanted to do more. So naturally, I started looking into the history of photography myself, and I stumbled upon a few photographers that really influenced me. The first one here is Robert Adams, who I'm told lives in Oregon, which is pretty cool. And this generation of photographers, the new Topographics generation, their impulse to show the man-altered landscape in conversation with the history of open, pristine landscape for the taking, thinking of like Ansel Adams. And I felt this impulse was still relevant in many ways, especially with the mythology of a place like Montana, and thinking about like the Wanderlust Instagram feeds. It felt like this mythology of like pristine, untouched land still existed in the culture. So it felt like these ideas of environmental stewardship brought forth by Robert Adams were also very important to me. You can see Robert Adams' subjectivity in the images, which was something that really grabbed me. I think they're very poetic and they sort of contemplate his own humanity. At the same time, I found Nan Goldin's Ballad of Sexual Dependency. This book was so meaningful to me. It kind of like punched me in the gut because it made me ache for a community I didn't have. But beyond that, Nan Goldin gave me permission to turn the camera on myself and the people around me. And I sort of gave myself, after viewing this work, permission to be more diaristic in my photo making. So these two like vastly different influences and approaches both sort of inform the way I make photographs. I also just want to mention a few movies as well. I love Greg Araki. He's one of my favorite directors, especially this film, The Living End, which chronicles two lovers who find out they're both HIV positive, and then they become fugitives and hit the road. This idea of escape really resonated with me. And I feel like you can't talk about morality and queerness without Brokeback Mountain by Ang Lee. But of course, it's a story that ends in violence, and I feel like those stories and those histories of violence towards queer people in the West are still very prevalent and real in many cases. And also Power of the Dog by Jane Campion was really influential. So with all these influences and all these things going on, I just began going out to the landscape every week, making 1 or 2 pictures, sometimes with my partner, sometimes alone. A lot of my practice is built by habitually shooting and making pictures all the time, which was a lot of the way this project started. It was a lot of stumbling around and sort of discovering things and being moved by things and just making images sort of unconsciously. And at the beginning, I feel like the 2 pictures here are earlier. They're a lot more pointed in many ways, like the housing development, this idea of the nuclear family, heteronormativity is very kind of pointed and rooted in images from Robert Adams and or more direct marks of violence in the land, like these 2 signs that had bullet holes through them. And then, as I've sort of moved along and learned more about myself and photography, I began taking more poetic images, like this one of a bird bander holding a chickadee. I was really moved by this gesture because the scientist was so tender with the birds, but he was also wearing this like very masculine army jacket. And I thought that duality of like concealment and interaction and touch was just very poetic. And into images like me, more interior shots, this pastoral landscape with this dead grass. They all sort of built into this poetic language I was trying to build about my experiences in the landscape, which is how I got here. So I feel like the ultimate form for this work is going to be a photo book because it is so narrative driven, and I feel like the sequencing and the pairings really bring forth potent meaning in a lot of the images. So that's sort of where I'm at now with the project. I'm in the process of having 200 prints on a table and shuffling them around and figuring out a sequence that I'd like to put into a book. But it's very hard to do. And that's all I have. Thanks for coming.
You want to
Any questions?
Any questions from the audience? Go ahead and just raise your hand. Yeah.
So you shot this in film and then you scanned the negatives, is that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I had no access to a darkroom until now in my life when I moved to Oregon. So I'm hoping to kind of go back and just experience that form and being in the darkroom and working with my hands. But in this show, they're all scans of negatives, yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how they evolve with printing them in the dark room.
Yeah.
You described these two sort of places you're coming from with Robert Adams and Nan Goldin influences.
Mm-hmm.
You can see in the pictures the landscapes, especially these extremely intentional, very slow, considered compositions, which is like the opposite of Nan Goldin.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of these, like the image of the rabbit, especially, is a very in the moment, intimate, flash in your face thing. When did you talk about like combining those two seemingly disparate things, and are there images that feel particularly successful of using those two lanes, or keep them separate?
I think they are two different languages in many ways. I think they work together through sequence mostly. I feel like this image maybe sort of hits that middle ground well. But I feel like for me, the aesthetics, the black and white, point more towards this cultural history in the West. And then my Nan Goldin sensibility had to do more with how I arrived at subject matter. That's kind of how I've navigated those influences. Yeah.
I already asked you about the bird one, but I'm curious again about the rabbit. Does that tie in with like your childhood raising sheep almost?
I mean, interactions with animals are very important to me. I think as a queer person, animals have always felt like a safe audience and community. The rabbit picture in particular, it's kind of an oddball in the sequence because it's an interior and it's with flash, but I sort of like that surprise in the sequence. That is my partner actually in Our Rabbit. And I made this picture of him holding the rabbit, mostly out of just like tenderness, but then the image that came back sort of had this intensity to it. And I liked that juxtaposition between like tenderness and violence, and maybe a suggestion or a way of seeing the image that could inform that. I've titled it, so they're all untitled, because I feel like they work together as one work. But in parentheses, that one's called dimorphous expression, and that refers to like nervous laughter, what is it? Oh, like pinching a baby's cheeks, like this like cute aggression. So yeah, that's the bunny, yeah.
So you mentioned they're all untitled in order to keep them cohesive, because they all do have subtitles.
Yeah, it's like, I think, because in many ways for me, the work falls apart when it's not together. Like isolating an image like the one behind you has this sort of, the deer head in the tree, this intense, violent gesture, and it feels like it's just kind of a heavy note on its own. So the titling for me was a way to maybe point to that idea. I don't know how successful it is, but then just for myself, in the parentheses, titling them as a feeling or a phenomena that I see in the image. Yeah.
I'm curious to know about the choice of the black and white. Is it because of the reference to this history that you mentioned and the aesthetics of the new topographics? Or there's something else, and have you ever tried working in color?
Yeah, so when I first began, it was color in black and white. And I ultimately was sort of drawn to black and white because there's this removal of descriptive information. Black and white is an abstraction of the way we see the world. And I like the sort of humanistic or poetic themes that can emerge in black and white, like absence, presence, shadow, light. It sort of makes the work more psychological rather than documentary for me. I also do think it points to this history in the West. Just being out there making pictures, it's hard to ignore the legacies of settler colonialism, but also the legacies of photography in the area as well. So it's sort of working in a few ways for me.